The porch railing was finished by the time Elvira Rhodes stepped out of the mercantile with a bolt of calico pressed against her chest and dust coating the hem of her dark skirt. She stopped dead on the board sidewalk of Redemption Creek, Texas, and stared at her small house at the end of Mill Road, and she felt the air leave her lungs as though the prairie wind had stolen it clean out of her body. 3 boys, the eldest no older than 17 and the youngest perhaps 12, were climbing down from her porch with hammers in hand and sawdust on their shoulders. She knew those boys. Everyone in Redemption Creek knew those boys. They were the Trask sons, and their father had not sent them. She was absolutely certain of that because Micah Trask had not spoken a single warm word in her direction in the 4 months since she had arrived, and a man did not send his sons to build a widow a porch railing out of the warmth of a cold heart. She understood immediately. With a clarity that struck her like lightning on a flat plain, she understood what it meant, and the understanding terrified her more than anything that had happened in the year of sorrow that had brought her to this God-forsaken corner of Texas. It meant that those boys had watched her grab the porch post every morning to keep from stumbling on the uneven step. It meant they had noticed the way she held the doorframe with both hands when the wind whipped up from the south. It meant they had gone to their father's lumber stash behind the barn, taken wood and nails and a measuring rope, and built her something without anyone asking them to, because their father had raised them to see a need and meet it. And a man did not raise 3 sons like that without having a heart capable of something enormous and terrifying, and completely inconvenient for a woman who had sworn to herself that she was done with love. Elvira's grip tightened on the calico bolt. Her eyes stung with something she refused to call tears. She had come to Redemption Creek in the autumn of 1878, exactly 11 months after burying her husband, James Rhodes, in the red clay soil of Georgia. James had been a gentle man who died of fever before his 35th birthday, leaving her a widow at 29 with $112, a deed to a house that the bank was about to claim, and a younger sister in San Antonio who wrote letters full of desperate optimism about opportunities in the West. Elvira had not come to Texas looking for love. She had come looking for survival, and those 2 things were supposed to remain completely separate. But Redemption Creek had a way of complicating intentions. The town sat in the dry scrub country between the hill country and the Caprock, and in 1878 it was exactly the kind of place that existed because cattle needed to pass through it and men needed to stop. There was a main street of perhaps a dozen buildings, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a livery, a saloon, a doctor's office attached to the pharmacy, and Callum's Mercantile, where Elvira had found work behind the counter within 3 days of arriving. The population hovered somewhere between 80 and 200, depending on the season and the cattle drives, and everyone knew everyone else's business with the determined enthusiasm of people who had very little else to occupy their minds. She had noticed Micah Trask on her 3rd day in town. It would have been impossible not to notice him. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders in the way that came from genuine work rather than the vanity of it, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a jaw that looked as though it had been chiseled from the same limestone that formed the bluffs above the creek. He came into the mercantile that 3rd morning to buy coffee and feed corn, and he moved through the space with the quiet authority of a man who had learned long ago that the world was a place requiring patience and strength in equal measure. He had looked at her across the counter with dark eyes that held absolutely no warmth, paid exact change without a word beyond the names of his goods, and walked out. The other women in town told her about him that same afternoon, because in Redemption Creek information traveled at the speed of loneliness. Margaret Callum, the mercantile owner's wife and Elvira's primary source of local intelligence, had settled herself onto the stool behind the second counter with a cup of tea and the look of a woman who had been waiting for the right moment. Micah Trask had been married to a woman named Caroline, a dark-haired woman from New Mexico Territory who had possessed, according to Margaret, both great beauty and a profound restlessness that the plains of Texas had ultimately failed to contain. Caroline Trask had left Redemption Creek in the spring of 1875, 3 years before Elvira's arrival, walking out on her husband and her 3 sons to follow a railroad surveyor who had passed through town in February. The eldest boy, Daniel, had been 14 at the time. The middle son, Samuel, had been 11. The youngest, Eli, had been only 8 years old. Caroline had been gone 6 weeks before Micah received a letter from Albuquerque, saying she would not be returning, and that she hoped he would understand. Micah Trask had apparently said nothing to anyone about it, had filed for legal dissolution of the marriage through the county court in the winter of 1876, had continued to run his cattle operation and his small farm on the eastern edge of town, and had raised his 3 sons with the kind of deliberate, steady attention that men of lesser character usually reserved for livestock. He had not courted another woman. He had not expressed interest in another woman. He had not, in 3 years, given anyone in Redemption Creek the slightest indication that he intended to do either of those things. Elvira had listened to all of this with her hands folded on the counter and her face arranged in polite neutrality, and she had thought, good. A man with no romantic intentions was a man she could handle. A man who kept to himself was a man who would leave her alone. She had her own recovery to manage, her own grief still working itself through her bones like a slow frost, and she did not need the complication of a man who looked at her with dark eyes and then looked away. What she had not anticipated was the children. The Trask boys came into the mercantile most Saturday mornings, usually Daniel leading with a list, and Samuel carrying the basket and Eli trailing behind with his hands in his pockets, and his eyes absorbing everything around him with the silent intensity of a child who processes the world slowly and completely. Elvira had noticed immediately that they were well-mannered in the particular way that suggested the manners were genuine rather than performed. They said please and thank you without being prompted. They waited their turn. They never knocked things from shelves. Eli, the youngest, had once quietly righted a display of tin pots that another customer had disturbed, without anyone asking him to or even noticing that he had done it. She had started to look forward to Saturday mornings with a guilty feeling she kept firmly private. By December of 1878, which was to say roughly 2 months after her arrival, she had learned their full names and their particular natures. Daniel was the oldest at 17 and carried himself with the gravity of a young man who understood he was being depended upon, with a kind of quiet pride that could have tipped over into arrogance in different circumstances, but hadn't, because whatever Micah Trask was doing with those boys, he was doing it right. Samuel was 15 and had inherited whatever sense of humor lived somewhere in the Trask family, arriving most mornings with a quiet observation about some absurdity he had witnessed during the week that made Elvira press her lips together to contain her smile. Eli was 12 and was the one who had started the whole impossible situation by speaking to her directly for the first time in December. He had been standing at the counter while Daniel sorted through a list, and Elvira had been wrapping coffee and salt, and Eli had looked up at her with those serious dark eyes and said, "Your porch step is rotting through." Elvira had blinked. "I beg your pardon. The second step on your front porch. The wood is soft all the way through on the left side. I noticed when I walked past on Wednesday." He had said it with the tone of a boy relaying useful information, not with any particular social agenda beyond the information itself. "You should get it fixed before the ice comes or somebody is going to fall through it." She had thanked him for telling her. She had looked at the step that evening and found he was absolutely correct. She had put it on the list of things she would deal with when she had money beyond bare necessity. And she had thought about the 12-year-old who had noticed something she had not noticed and mentioned it to her without any prompting, because apparently the Trask family had a particular affliction for seeing a need and naming it. It was in January of 1879, on a bitter Sunday after the church service, that she first had a real conversation with Micah Trask himself, and she would later identify this as the moment the trouble truly began. She had been struggling with a fence post on the south side of her property, trying to reset it where the frost had heaved it loose from the ground, and she had the post iron and the tamping bar, and approximately no idea what she was doing, because James had handled fences, and she had handled everything else in their marriage, and this particular division of labor had seemed entirely practical, until she found herself alone on a January morning being beaten by a fence post. She heard boots on the frozen ground and turned to find Micah Trask standing 6 feet away, watching her with an expression she could not immediately read. He had his hat in his hand and his coat collar turned up against the wind. "You need to tamp from both sides to get the frost out," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The wind moved between them with great indifference. "I'm aware," she said, which was not entirely true. "You're not doing it from both sides. Thank you for the observation." There was a pause. He put his hat back on his head. "Mind if I show you?" She almost said no. She held the refusal in her mouth for a full 3 seconds before pragmatism overrode pride. "I suppose not." He had taken the bar from her without ceremony, without making her feel incapable, without the particular condescension that some men wrapped around assistance like a gift that was really a debt. He had showed her the technique with the same tone Eli had used about the step, which was to say the tone of a person sharing useful information. They had reset the post together, her holding the post straight while he tamped, and he had explained what he was doing in short, clear sentences without a single unnecessary word, and when it was done, he had handed the bar back to her and said, "You've got a good eye for level. Most people can't tell by sight." She had looked at him, genuinely surprised by the compliment, and for a moment his expression had shifted into something that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. "Your sons are good boys," she said, because she had been wanting to say it for 2 months and this seemed like an opportunity. Something moved in his face. It was brief and controlled and gone before she could fully categorize it, but she thought it was the expression of a man who loved something so much the love had become a vulnerability he kept carefully covered. "They are," he said simply. He had walked back to his property on the eastern side of town, and Elvira had stood by her repaired fence post in the January cold, and felt something shift inside her chest that she was absolutely determined to call indigestion. February brought a cattle dispute with a neighboring rancher named Aldous Cray, a man with small eyes and a large sense of grievance, who had filed a complaint with the county claiming that Micah Trask's cattle were crossing his fence line and grazing his land. The claim was the subject of considerable discussion at the Mercantile, where Elvira heard most of Redemption Creek's ongoing dramas from the position of the counter. Margaret Callum had firm opinions. "Aldous Cray has been trying to push Micah Trask off that East Range for 3 years, she told Elvira one Tuesday morning with the confidence of a woman who believed she knew all relevant facts about all relevant matters. "Ever since Micah expanded his herd after Caroline left. Cray thinks widowed men lose their nerve, and he thought Micah would fold, but Micah Trask has not folded." Elvira had absorbed this and continued arranging spice tins. It was the following Saturday that Daniel Trask had come in alone without his brothers and had bought the usual supplies and then stood at the counter for a moment before saying in a low, careful voice, "Miss Rhodes, did my father say something to offend you?" She looked up sharply. "Of course not. Why would you ask that?" Daniel looked at the counter. "He's been in a strange mood. I know it's not related to the cattle thing because he handles that fine. I thought maybe he'd said something that didn't come out right." He raised his eyes and she saw in them both the concern of a son and something else, something older, a kind of watchfulness that came from 3 years of being the eldest child in a home that had already been cracked once by someone leaving. He isn't always good at saying things the way he means them. Elvira felt the words move through her like a current. She said carefully, "Your father has been nothing but respectful to me." Daniel nodded. He picked up his basket. At the door he paused. He mentioned your fence post came out good. And then he was gone, and Elvira was left standing in the mercantile trying very hard not to feel anything in particular, which was becoming progressively more difficult. March arrived with warmer air from the Gulf and a traveling preacher named Holloway who conducted a 3-day revival in the church, and concluded his stay by holding a community supper in the yard of the schoolhouse, which was also the church yard, which was the same yard, because Redemption Creek operated with great efficiency of space. Elvira attended because Margaret had asked her to bring the apple preserves she had put up in October, and because she did not yet have the social footing to decline invitations from Margaret without consequence. The evening was fine and warm and full of the pleasant chaos of a small community gathering, with children running between the tables and men talking about cattle prices and women managing most of the actual work of feeding everyone. And Elvira had been moderately enjoying herself in the distant way that she enjoyed most things in those months, which was to say she was present and functional but not fully invested. She had been carrying a stack of tin plates from one table to another when she had nearly collided with Micah Trask coming around the corner of the building from the other direction. They had both stopped, plates between them, closer than they had stood before, close enough that she could see the silver in his hair and the weathering around his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "My fault," he said, at exactly the same moment, and the simultaneity of it produced an awkward pause in which neither of them moved. Eli appeared from around the same corner, saw them standing still, and looked between them with those serious dark eyes. "Are you both stuck?" he asked. It was so straightforward and so unexpected that Elvira laughed, a genuine laugh that came out before she could moderate it, and she heard Micah Trask make a sound beside her that she realized with a shock was also a laugh, low and short and real, and the sound of it rearranged something in the room that she was not ready for. They had eaten supper at the same table with his 3 sons and Margaret and her husband Callum and 2 other families, and Micah Trask had been different in that context in a way she had not predicted. He had not talked much, but what he said had been dry and precise and frequently funny in a way that surprised the whole table, and she had watched his sons respond to him with the easy comfort of children who felt safe, and she had thought with a pain that surprised her, "This is what it looks like when it works." She rode home that night in the borrowed wagon with a head full of things she was not prepared to examine. April was when the letters began. Not love letters, nothing remotely approaching love letters, nothing that could be characterized as anything but practical correspondence between neighbors. He left the first note in the mercantile for her, tucked under the edge of the counter where she would find it, written in a plain, careful hand. "There are wild onions coming up along the creek bank at the base of the limestone bluff. Good for cooking if you need them." She had stood there holding the small piece of paper for a long time. She had left her response on the gate post of the fence he passed on his way to town, a small slip of paper that said, "Thank you. Do you want to split them?" He came to the creek that afternoon with a canvas bag and they had gathered onions together in the late April sunshine, mostly without talking, in a silence that was companionable rather than uncomfortable. And she had realized partway through the afternoon that she had not felt comfortable being quiet near another person since James died. That grief had made her anxious in silence because silence had become the shape of absence. But this particular silence felt different. Felt inhabited rather than empty. She was in genuine trouble and she knew it. The problem was that knowing you were in trouble was not the same as being able to do anything about it. She went home with her share of the onions and sat at her kitchen table and tried to be rational about the situation, which she listed as follows. She was a widow of 11 months standing, newly established in a new town, with no financial security beyond her employment at the mercantile. He was a divorced man with 3 sons and a cattle operation and a wound in his history that had not fully healed. Neither of them was looking for this. Neither of them had said anything remotely resembling an expression of feeling. The whole thing existed entirely in onion-gathering silences and fence-post repairs, and a handful of notes that could all be interpreted as simple neighborliness. She went to bed telling herself she was imagining things. She woke in the morning thinking about the sound of him laughing. May was difficult for reasons that had nothing to do with Micah Trask, which was almost a relief. A letter arrived from her sister Clara in San Antonio, carrying the news that Clara's husband Robert had lost his business to debt, and that they were in serious trouble. And while Elvira could not actually help in any material way, given her own circumstances, the letter pulled her back into her grief and her worry, and the awareness that she was very far from everything familiar and building a life from bare materials, and some days it was exhausting beyond what she could reasonably hold. She had been sitting on her front porch on a Wednesday evening in the first week of May with the letter in her lap, and her face doing things she would not have allowed in public when she heard footsteps on the path. She looked up and saw Micah Trask standing at her gate, not coming through it, just standing there with his hat in his hand and an expression that suggested he had arrived without a fully formed plan. "I was passing by," he said. She looked at him. Her face was undoubtedly telling him things she had not consented to share. He looked at the letter in her lap and then at her face and then away at the middle distance in a way that felt like giving her privacy without removing his presence, which was a very particular and careful thing to do. He said quietly, "Bad news. My sister's husband lost their business," she said, because the words came out before the guard could stop them. "They're in a difficult situation. I can't help them." He was quiet for a moment. "Can they come here?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon." "If they're in a bad spot, could they come here and start over?" He said it the way he said most things, without sentiment, as though the logistics were the point. "There's work. The rail line is pushing west. Robert, is he capable?" "He's a very capable man who made some bad decisions," she said, and heard in her own voice a loyalty that surprised her. "Most people in this town are the same," he said. And then, after a pause, "I'm sorry about your troubles, Miss Rhodes." She looked at him standing there with his hat in his hand in the May evening, and she felt the full weight of what she was feeling and could not, absolutely could not, pretend it was indigestion anymore. "Would you like to sit on the porch?" she said. He looked at the porch. He looked at her. He put his hat back on his head in a way that seemed like a decision being made. "I would," he said, and came through the gate. They sat in the two chairs on the porch while the evening went dark around them, and the prairie settled into its nighttime sounds, and she told him about Clara and Robert, and he listened the way he did everything, which was with his whole attention, asking only the occasional question that moved the conversation forward rather than redirecting it toward himself. And after a while she had told him about Georgia and James and the long year of grief, and she had done it without crying, which she considered a significant achievement. And when she finished there was a silence, and he said, "I know what it is to rebuild from nothing. It gets better. It takes longer than anyone tells you, but it gets better." She looked at him in the dark. "Is that from experience?" A pause. "Some of it." She understood that he meant Caroline without her having to name it, and she understood also that he was not going to say more than that, and that was right. That was the correct amount for this evening, this porch, this beginning of whatever this was. He left an hour later, tipping his hat at the gate, and she sat alone on the porch until well past midnight, trying to understand what had happened to her careful, sensible, self-protective plan. June brought heat, and the cattle dispute with Aldous Cray escalating to the point where the county magistrate had to ride out from the county seat at Millbrook and conduct an actual hearing, and Elvira heard the whole proceedings through Margaret's comprehensive reporting. Cray had produced witnesses claiming Trask cattle had been seen on his range, and Trask had produced survey markers and grazing records, and the magistrate had ruled in Trask's favor, and Cray had left the courthouse with the face of a man storing a grudge for later use, which everyone in Redemption Creek noted with the particular concern of people who knew Aldous Cray's particular variety of patience. It was in June also that Elvira and Micah had their first actual argument, which she would later identify as significant, because you did not argue with people you did not care about. It happened at the Mercantile on a Thursday morning when she had overheard him telling Callum that he thought the new school curriculum being proposed by the district, which included instruction in Spanish language and Mexican history alongside the standard subjects, was unnecessary. She had been wrapping flour on the other side of the room and she had turned around, which she later admitted to herself was not strictly her business, and said, "I disagree with that." He had looked at her with the expression of a man somewhat surprised to be disagreed with publicly. The children need English and arithmetic and geography. They live on the Texas-Mexico border, she said, setting down the flour with more firmness than she intended. Spanish is not a foreign language in this part of the country. It is the language of half the people they will do business with and work beside their entire lives. And the history of this place belongs as much to the families who have been here for 200 years as to anyone who arrived last month. She stopped, aware that she had perhaps said more than the moment required, and looked at him across the room. He held her gaze for a long moment. There was something working in his expression that she could not fully read. Then he said, "That is a fair point," and turned back to his conversation with Callum. Margaret caught her eye from behind the second counter with an expression of absolute delighted amazement. Elvira turned back to her flour. On Saturday, Micah came in and bought the usual supplies, and as he was leaving he stopped at the door and said, without turning around, "I spoke to the school board yesterday, told them the Spanish curriculum made sense." She did not say anything. He left. She stood with her hands on the counter, feeling something warm and specific moving through her chest that she had no rational response to. The notes continued through June and into July, growing gradually longer, accumulating a texture and an intimacy that neither of them named directly. He had written about a hawk's nest he had found in the cottonwoods along the east fence, the young birds almost ready to fledge. She had written back describing a medicinal plant she had found along the creek bank and was not quite sure how to identify. And he had ridden over the following afternoon and identified it as wild bergamot and told her how to dry it for tea. She had made the tea the following Sunday and taken a jar of it to his property, which was the first time she had been there, and she had stood in the yard of his well-maintained but fundamentally functional home and seen immediately the ways that a man was raising 3 sons alone, the clean order of it, the practicality, the complete absence of the small softnesses that a woman's presence brings to a space. And she had felt something that was partly tenderness and partly heartbreak, and partly a thing she was not naming. Daniel had found her standing in the yard while his father was at the barn, and had walked over with an expression of studied casualness that she could see right through. "What do you think of the place?" he had asked. "It's very well kept," she said carefully. "We've been talking about fixing up the porch," Daniel said, in a tone that was working very hard at being offhand. "The railing's been gone since last winter. A branch took it out in a storm." "That's practical," she said, and looked at him, and he looked back at her with the particular expression of a 17-year-old who thought he was being subtle and was not. Micah had emerged from the barn and the moment had dissolved, and they had sat in the yard drinking the bergamot tea from tin cups, and it had been so ordinary and so specific, and so much like something she had not known she was missing that she had driven home in the borrowed wagon feeling dangerously full of something that had no safe container. July grew hotter. She wrote to Clara encouraging Robert to consider Texas, telling him there was work, telling him the land was difficult but honest. She received a reply saying they were considering it, that it was terrifying, that Clara was grateful. She pinned the letter above her writing table and felt slightly less alone. The trouble with Aldous Cray reappeared at the end of July in a form that was more direct than a legal complaint. 3 of Micah's cattle were found dead near the south fence line, shot at close range. The incident clearly designed to look like it could have been done by anyone, but carrying Cray's particular signature of plausible deniability. Micah had reported it to the county sheriff, a deliberate man named Horace Birch, who wore his badge with the gravity of someone who had seen what happened when law went soft and was determined not to contribute to that outcome. Birch had ridden out to Cray's property, and Cray had expressed appropriate shock and denied everything, and the investigation had produced no physical evidence, and nothing had been done. Elvira had heard about it through Margaret and had spent the evening in a state of anger that surprised her with its intensity, anger on his behalf, a protectiveness that she turned over several times trying to understand it. When she had finally admitted to herself what the anger was actually about, she had pressed her hand flat against the kitchen table and breathed steadily for a long time. She went to his property the next morning with a reason she had manufactured, a book she had promised to lend Samuel, and found Micah in the yard mending saddle leather with the expression of a man containing something large. She handed Samuel the book and watched him take it inside with genuine delight, and she turned to Micah and said quietly, "I heard about the cattle, I'm sorry." He pulled a stitch through the leather. "It's done. Is there anything you can do about Cray?" "Not without evidence." The stitch pulled tight. "So I watch and I wait and I keep records, and I do not give him reason to do worse." He looked up at her, and she saw in his eyes the cost of that patience, the deliberate suppression of a response that would feel better in the short term and be destructive in the long term, and she thought, here is a man who has learned the discipline of the long game in everything. "That takes character," she said. He held her gaze. Something in his expression moved, not the almost smile of January, but something more direct, more vulnerable, the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being seen and had just momentarily been seen. He said simply, "Thank you, Elvira," and it was the first time he had used her Christian name, and the sound of it in his voice was something she was going to be thinking about for a considerable time. She rode home with her borrowed horse and her racing heart, and her complete inability to remain sensibly detached. August was when things changed irrevocably, and the mechanism of the change was the most ordinary thing imaginable. She had been unwell for 4 days with a summer fever, not seriously ill but weakened enough to miss 2 days of work at the mercantile. And on the 5th day, when she was recovered enough to sit up properly and attempt solid food, she heard activity on her porch. She had looked out the window and seen what she was seeing now, what she had seen when she came out of the mercantile with the calico bolt, the 3 Trask boys, finishing a porch railing. She sat at the window for a long time watching them work. She watched the way Daniel directed the younger two, not with authority but with the casual ease of a boy who had been given responsibility and learned to carry it without making it heavy. She watched Samuel measure twice, before cutting with a care that suggested someone had taught him that particular discipline. She watched Eli, the youngest, fit the balusters with a focus that was entirely his own, that serious absorption with the task in front of him that she had first noticed when he righted the tin pots in the mercantile 8 months ago. She understood what it meant. She understood it all the way through. These boys had watched her grab the post when her legs were weak with fever. They had noticed the missing railing, the gap where safety should have been. They had gone home to their father's lumber and his tools, and they had built her something she needed before she could even ask for it. And they had done it because they had been raised by a man who saw need and met it without announcement or requirement of gratitude. And they had done it because, on some level that she could not look at directly without it being too much, they had done it because they wanted her to stay. She went out to the porch. 3 boys looked up at her, dusty and proud and careful in the way of children who have done something meaningful and are not sure how it will be received. "This is the most beautiful railing I have ever seen," she said, and her voice was steady, which was a miracle. Eli looked at the railing critically. "The joint on the south end is a little uneven," he said, which was so entirely in character that she felt the laugh come up through her chest before she could stop it. "It is absolutely perfect," she said firmly. "Did your father know you were coming?" A pause. The three of them exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. Daniel said with great care he did not know. She looked at him for a moment. "I see." Samuel had the expression of someone trying not to smile. "He checked the lumber before we left." She stood there holding the porch post, which she no longer needed to hold because the railing was there now, solid and straight and built with care. She looked at the three of them. She made a decision. "Would you like to stay for supper?" The smiles that crossed their faces were the kind of smiles that are made of relief, and she understood that too. She sent Daniel to find his father. She went inside and began to cook with everything she had in the house, which was more than usual because Margaret had brought a basket of things when she was ill. And she made a proper meal, a real meal, the first meal she had cooked for more than herself since Georgia, and the kitchen filled with smells that were warm and human and domestic in a way that made the house feel, for the first time since she had moved into it, like a place where life was actually happening. Micah arrived at the door with his hat in his hand and an expression she was finally learning to read, which was to say the expression of a man whose feelings were entirely visible to someone paying the right kind of attention, even when his face was doing its level best to be unreadable. "I understand your sons built me a porch railing," she said. He met her eyes. "They had a mind to. You checked the lumber before they left." A pause. "Someone had to make sure they had good materials." She looked at him standing there in her doorway with his hat in his hand and his dark eyes and his silver temples, and his three sons already seated at her table with the eagerness of boys who have done a thing they are quietly proud of. And she said quietly, so only he could hear her, "Come in, Micah." He came in. They ate supper together, all five of them, and it was loud in a way that her house had never been before. Samuel making jokes and Eli making corrections, and Daniel trying to manage both of them, and Micah occasionally saying something quiet and dry that put all three boys in their place without diminishing them. And Elvira sat at the table that she had sat alone at every evening for 8 months, and felt something she had believed was behind her opening like a window. Micah stayed after the boys went out to the porch to look at their handiwork in the last light. He helped her clear the table without being asked, with the same naturalness with which his sons had built the railing, and they stood at the wash basin together in her small kitchen, and she washed the dishes and he dried them, and it was so entirely ordinary and so entirely not ordinary that she did not trust herself to speak for several minutes. He spoke first. "Elvira." Not a question, not a preamble, just her name, the way he had said it in July at the saddle leather, direct and careful. She kept her eyes on the basin. "Yes, I am not a man who is easy," he said, in a voice that was so controlled it told her exactly how much effort the control was costing him. "I have 3 boys and a cattle operation and a history that I would not choose for anyone to inherit, and I am not good at saying things the way I mean them, as you have probably observed." She turned and looked at him. He was holding a tin plate, dry and forgotten in his hands, looking at her with an expression that was finally entirely unguarded. "I've observed the opposite, actually," she said carefully. "I think you say exactly what you mean. I think what's difficult is finding the right moment to say it." Something in his face changed. It was not the almost smile. It was the thing behind the almost smile, the thing she had been watching move toward the surface for months, and it was in his eyes and around his mouth, and in the way his hands tightened slightly on the plate. "I would like to call on you properly," he said, "if that is something you are willing to consider." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about James, about the goodness of loving someone and the devastation of losing them, about the way grief had rewritten her understanding of risk. She thought about 8 months of notes and onions and fence posts, and a porch railing built without being asked. She thought about those 3 boys at her table looking like they were exactly where they wanted to be. "I think I would be willing to consider it," she said. He set the plate down. He was close to smiling, she could see it, and she understood from the rarity of it that it meant something. "Good," he said. September in Texas was still warm enough that the evenings on the porch were possible, and September was when Micah Trask came to call properly. Hat in hand, 3 evenings a week, and Redemption Creek watched with the devoted interest of a community that had been waiting for precisely this development, and was thoroughly gratified to see it occurring. Margaret was incandescent with satisfaction. She did not say, "I told you so," but only because she had never actually predicted it out loud, which she appeared to regret. Micah brought her things. Not flowers, which would have been impractical in this country and in this season, but things that were useful and considered, and told her more about how he thought than any speech could have done. A good knife to replace the worn one she had been using in the kitchen, because he had noticed the worn one when he cleared the table. A book of botanical illustrations, because she had mentioned the bergamot plant. A length of good rope, because she had said the garden gate needed a better latch, and he had seen the latch and knew the rope would solve it before she had worked that out herself. She gave him things in return. She mended a tear in Daniel's good coat that had been waiting for attention. She copied out a recipe for the dried apple cake that Eli had eaten 3 helpings of at supper and asked about twice since. She wrote out a formal letter for the school board supporting the Spanish curriculum expansion that he had intended to write himself but had not yet found the words for, and she handed it to him at the gate one evening with the clear offer to let him sign it if he agreed with the wording, and he read it standing at the gate in the fading light, and then looked at her with an expression that was almost wondering. "This is better than anything I would have written," he said. "You know the arguments," she said. "I just organized them." "You are very intelligent," he said, with a directness that was not flattery but observation, and it landed on her like something she had not known she needed. The argument happened in late September, the second one, the one that was more serious. It began with a comment he made about Clara and Robert, who had written to say they were genuinely considering the move to Texas, and Micah had said something about Robert needing to have a plan before arriving, something about men who came west without a plan being more trouble than they were worth, and Elvira had heard in it a judgment on her brother-in-law that she felt was premature and unfair, and she had said so with more heat than she intended. Micah had held his ground, which was itself simultaneously infuriating and something she respected, and they had disagreed at length on the porch in the September evening in voices that were not quite raised but were definitely not contained, and at the end of it he had said, "I know you want to protect him. That's a good instinct. I just don't want you to be hurt if it doesn't work out." She had looked at him. "Is that what this is about? Protecting me from disappointment?" A long pause. Among other things, she had let the silence stretch before saying quietly, "I have already been through the thing you are most afraid will happen to me. I buried my husband. I sold my house. I moved 2,000 miles to start over with $112 and a borrowed wagon. I think I am capable of managing disappointment." His jaw had tightened. Something worked behind his eyes. He said very quietly, "I know you are. I know that. I am sorry." The apology landed simply, without ornament, and she felt the heat of the argument drain away and leave something cleaner and more honest in its place. A man who apologized when he was wrong was not a man who would repeat the wrong indefinitely. She had been with men who could not apologize, and she understood the difference. "Write to Robert," she said after a while. "Tell him what he'd need. He'll appreciate having a straight answer." Micah had written the letter. It was long and practical and, she suspected, kinder in tone than he would have admitted to, because she had read it before he sealed it, and she had recognized in its directness a genuine attempt to be useful to a man he had not met. October brought Clara and Robert. They arrived on the stage from San Antonio on the 14th of October, Clara with her dark hair and her familiar face and her arms around Elvira before she was fully off the coach step. And Elvira had held her sister in the middle of the Redemption Creek Main Street, and felt something that had been clenched in her chest since February of the previous year begin, very slowly, to release. Robert was a compact, practical man with capable hands, and an obvious shame about the business failure that he wore like a garment he could not take off. Micah had arranged work for him with the rail line survey crew that was pushing through the county, heavy labor but honest pay. And Robert had taken the handshake from Micah with the expression of a man who was both grateful and humbled, and trying to be both without being pathetic about it. And Micah had shaken his hand with the same directness he applied to everything and said, "It's good work. You'll be good at it." And Elvira had watched Robert's shoulders drop a quarter-inch in relief. Clara had taken one look at Micah Trask, and then one look at her sister, and raised her eyebrows with a subtlety that communicated approximately everything she was thinking. Elvira had given her the expression that communicated. Later in the small house over tea, Clara had said, "He is extraordinary." "He is complicated," Elvira said. "Those are not mutually exclusive conditions," Clara said, and stirred her tea with the air of a woman who had been married for 5 years and knew things. November. The question Elvira had been living alongside since August, since the railing, since supper and dishwashing and September evenings on the porch, came to a point in November at a community dance held in the church hall to mark the end of the harvest. Redemption Creek did not have a great deal to celebrate, but it celebrated what it had with genuine commitment. And the hall had been cleared of its regular furniture, and someone had procured a fiddle and an accordion, and the whole town had assembled with the enthusiasm of people who were mostly lonely and very glad for the permission to be otherwise for one evening. She danced with Callum out of politeness, and with Robert because Clara pushed him at her, and with Samuel Trask because Samuel asked with such cheerful lack of self-consciousness that refusing would have been unkind. She did not dance with Micah Trask because he did not ask her, and she was halfway across the hall thinking about that when she turned and found him beside her. "I am not a good dancer," he said. "Neither am I. Would you like to not dance well together?" She looked at him in the lantern light of the church hall, this man who had fixed her fence post in January and gathered onions with her in April, and sat on her porch in the dark while she talked about grief and sent his sons to build her a railing without being asked, and she said yes. He danced badly. He was entirely right about that. He had no rhythm to speak of, and his footwork was confident in the wrong direction. But he had her hand in his and his other hand at her back, and they moved through the room in a way that was less dancing and more mutual navigation. And she was laughing before the first minute was up. A real laugh, the same kind that had come out of her at the community supper in March, and she felt his chest move against hers with the vibration of his own laugh. "You are a terrible dancer," she said. "I warned you," he said. "You did," she said, and looked up at him, and the laughter faded into something else. Something that was not laughter but was made of the same material, warm and entirely present, and his hand tightened at her back just slightly. He walked her home that night in the cold November air with Clara and Robert walking ahead of them and his 3 sons trailing behind them in the manner of an honor guard trying to look casual, and at her gate he stopped. He looked at her in the starlight. He said without preamble, "I would like to marry you." She felt it through her whole body, the statement, the simple, direct, impossible statement. "That is not exactly a proposal," she said, because she needed a moment. "I know," a pause. "I want to do it properly. I have a ring that was my mother's. I want to ask you with it on the porch in daylight with your full consideration and your ability to refuse without social consequence." She looked at him. She thought of everything, all of it, the months of it. "You know," she said slowly, "that I am not easy either. I know. I have opinions that I express. I have noticed. And grief that is not entirely resolved." His voice was very quiet. "Elvira, I am not looking for uncomplicated. I am looking for you." She pressed her hand against the gate post, the solid wood of it under her palm. Behind her she could hear Clara making no effort whatsoever to pretend she was not listening. She could hear Eli informing his brothers in a stage whisper that something important was happening. "Come to the porch on Sunday," she said, "with your mother's ring." The light that moved through his face was not the almost smile. It was the thing beyond it, unconstrained and real, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in this country that was still full of beautiful things she had not expected. Sunday was the 15th of November, 1879, which was cool and clear with a sky the color of water and the smell of cedar from the hills. He came to her door at 2 in the afternoon, Daniel and Samuel and Eli waiting at the gate with the studied nonchalance of boys who were absolutely not holding their breath, and he came up the porch steps that she could now climb without holding anything because the railing was there, solid and straight and built with care. He proposed with a simplicity that was entirely him. He told her he loved her. He said it plainly and without performance, in the same voice he used for every true thing, and told her that the ring had been his mother's, and that his mother had been a good woman, and he could think of no one he would rather see wearing it. He told her that his sons wanted this, had wanted this since before he had admitted it to himself, and that they had built the railing on their own because they were, in this as in most things, ahead of him. He told her that he understood she might have reasons to hesitate and that he would take whatever time she needed. She said yes before he finished the sentence. He put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band with a small turquoise stone, southwestern in style, which told her something about his mother that she filed away to ask about later. And then he kissed her for the first time, on her porch in the November sunlight, with the new railing solid against his hand, and his 3 boys erupting from the gate in a chaos of celebration that was loud enough to bring Margaret Callum out of her house 2 lots away, who immediately burst into tears of satisfaction. They were married in December, in the church that was also the schoolhouse, in a ceremony performed by the traveling preacher Holloway, who had returned for a second revival and found the wedding a welcome addition to his schedule. Clara stood with Elvira. Robert stood with Micah. The 3 boys stood together at the front of the church in their good clothes, Daniel composed, Samuel grinning, Eli serious as always until the exact moment the preacher pronounced them married, at which point Eli's whole face shifted into something so openly joyful that Elvira had to work very hard to maintain her own composure. She moved into the Trask house with her furniture and her books and her botanical illustrations, and the bergamot tea, and the calico she had not yet made into anything, and the house changed immediately in the way she had known it would, the way it needed to, the small softnesses appearing in the spaces where there had only been practicality, and the boys responded to each change with the careful appreciation of people who had been waiting for it without knowing they were waiting. She learned the rhythms of the household. Daniel was the one who needed to talk through decisions before he could make them. Samuel needed his jokes taken seriously as often as they were laughed at. Eli needed silence respected, needed his process not hurried, needed to be understood as complete rather than peculiar. She learned these things by watching and by asking and by being entirely wrong sometimes and asking again. Micah watched her learn them with an expression she recognized as love in its deepest form, the love that is also gratitude, also wonder, also the particular relief of a person who has carried something heavy for a long time and has finally been given permission to set it down. They learned each other. They had their disagreements because they were both people with strong opinions and the willingness to express them, and the disagreements were real but they were never vicious, and they never left marks that didn't heal. She learned that he was not a man who went to sleep angry, that he had a principle about settling things before the end of the day, and she found that she admired the principle enough to adopt it herself. He learned that she needed to be heard before she could be helped, that when she brought him a problem she did not always want a solution. Sometimes she wanted a witness, and he learned to ask which one she needed and to provide the correct one. The Aldous Cray situation came to its resolution in January of 1880, 2 months into their marriage, and it came through the mechanism of Cray's own arrogance finally exceeding his caution. 3 hands from Cray's ranch were caught in the act of cutting Trask fence line on the South Range, caught by Daniel and Samuel, who had gone to check the line at their father's request, and had the presence of mind to hold the men at rifle point and send Eli back for the sheriff. Horace Birch had arrived with a deputy and arrested all 3 men, and their subsequent interrogation had produced testimony implicating Cray in the cattle killing the previous July, and in 2 other incidents of property damage. Cray had been arrested, tried at the county seat, and convicted, losing his ranch in the resulting proceedings. It was not a dramatic ending, no confrontation at high noon, no shots fired, and Elvira was glad of that. She had not wanted drama. She had wanted justice, and in this case the law had provided it at a pace that felt, to everyone who had been watching and waiting, like relief. Micah had said when it was done, "I want to teach the boys that the law is worth trusting. That you can be patient and keep records and do things right and the system will work." He had paused. "I know it doesn't always. I know there are injustices in this country that the law will not fix, not in my lifetime, but where it can work, it should." She had thought about what he said for a long time. She had thought about the Mexican families in the area whose land claims were consistently treated with less seriousness than those of Anglo settlers. She had thought about the people this system failed every day. "You're right that it doesn't always," she said. "I think you should tell the boys that as clearly as you tell them the other part. That being on the right side of the law is not the same as being on the right side of everything." He had looked at her steadily. "You're right," he said. And that evening he had said that to his sons at the supper table, said it clearly and without hedging, said that the country they lived in had injustices built into its structure, and that being decent men meant knowing the difference between what was legal and what was right and choosing right when they conflicted. Daniel had asked, "How do you know which is which?" Micah had said, "You ask your mother. She's better at knowing than I am." She had looked at him across the table and felt, in that moment, the fullness of what this was. Spring came warm and generous. Clara and Robert had settled well, Robert advancing from survey labor to a supervisory position with the rail line, Clara finding community and purpose in the school board discussions that Elvira had introduced her to. Their presence in Redemption Creek was a comfort that Elvira had not anticipated needing as much as she did, the company of her blood family alongside the family she was building. Daniel turned 18 in April of 1880 and began talking seriously about land of his own, about the possibility of filing a claim in the county to the west, where land was still available. Micah handled it with the careful pride of a father who has been working toward this moment for years without admitting it, helping Daniel think through the plan, connecting him with people who knew the territory, making it clear that wanting his own land was right and good, and not any kind of abandonment. Elvira had a long conversation with Daniel the evening before he left to look at the land, sitting on the porch in the April evening, and she told him what she had come to understand about his father, which was that Micah Trask's reserve was not indifference but its opposite, that the things he felt most deeply were the ones he was most careful about expressing, and that Daniel would know all his life, even if his father never said it in the right words, that he was loved without condition or reservation. Daniel had listened to her with that grave, careful attention and then said, "I know. I've always known." He looked at the railing his younger brothers had built. "We built this because we wanted you to stay. We didn't say that." "I understood," she said. "I thought you did," he said. "That's why we did it." He rode west in May and wrote back 2 weeks later to say he had found his land, 40 good acres on a creek tributary, and that the soil was promising. Micah read the letter twice and then folded it and put it in his chest pocket and went to the barn, and Elvira gave him 20 minutes before she followed and found him cleaning tack with the deliberate focus of a man managing emotion through his hands. "He's going to be fine," she said. "Better than fine," he said, not looking up. "He's going to be himself." She put her hand over his on the saddle leather and felt him still. "You did that," she said. "Everything you gave him he's going to build on. That's what it looks like when it works." He turned his hand and held hers. He looked at her. "You've given him things I couldn't," he said. "Things I didn't know how to give." "We gave him those together," she said firmly. He looked at her for a long moment. This man who was still learning to receive comfort as naturally as he gave it. This man who would spend the rest of his life being shaped by the fact that someone had chosen him when they did not have to. And she watched him accept what she had said and find it true. Together, he agreed quietly. Samuel at 15 was becoming the person he would be, and the person he was becoming was excellent. The humor had deepened without losing its lightness, and he was showing an aptitude for mathematics that Elvira had begun cultivating with real purpose, bringing him books from the library the schoolteacher kept in the church, spending Sunday afternoons at the kitchen table working through problems with him, while Micah did the accounts and Eli read by the window in one of those silences that were the texture of the household. Samuel was talking about engineering, about the railroads, about the bridges and water systems being built across the West. Elvira was writing letters to schools in Austin on his behalf, and Samuel knew she was doing it and thanked her for it in his particular way, which was to be quietly more present, to seek her company with a naturalness that meant something. Eli was 13, going on 40, and he was the one she understood most deeply in some ways, because she recognized in his serious attention to the world a particular kind of intelligence that looked like solemnity, but was actually a very complete engagement with everything around him. He had started drawing, filling the margins of his schoolwork, and then whole sheets of paper with detailed sketches of plants and birds, and the limestone formations of the creek bluff, and the drawings were genuinely remarkable. Elvira had shown them to the school teacher, a woman named Mrs. Pratt who had been educated in St. Louis, and Mrs. Pratt had agreed that they were remarkable and had given Eli proper drawing paper and shown him some basic principles of perspective that he had absorbed in one afternoon and immediately surpassed. She told Micah about the drawings one evening in bed, lying in the dark of their room in the house that was fully hers now, and she could feel him listening in the dark, the quality of his attention. "I know," he said. "I've been watching him. I don't know what to do with it." "Let him do it," she said. "Don't make it something he has to justify, just let him do it." "He'll want to do something with it eventually," Micah said. "Something practical." "Things that are beautiful are practical," she said. "They make the world livable. That's as practical as a fence post." She could feel him thinking about this in the dark. After a while he said, "You change the way I see things." She turned toward him. "Good or bad?" She could hear the smile in his voice. "Almost entirely good." She found out she was pregnant in June of 1880. She sat with the knowledge for 3 days before she told him, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she needed those 3 days to fully understand what she was feeling, which was complex and layered, and included joy and fear and grief for James, who had wanted children they had not managed to have, and a particular awe at the improbability of arriving here at this, through everything that had been required to get here. She told him on the porch on a Sunday evening, and he went very still in the way that large feelings made him still, and then he reached for her hand and held it and said nothing for a long time, and then said simply, "Are you well?" "I'm well," she said. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, not a romantic gesture so much as a reverent one, and she felt it all the way through. The boys were told at supper that week. Samuel's response was immediate and vocal and enthusiastic in a way that filled the whole room. Eli looked at her for a long moment and then at his plate and then back at her and said, "Are you happy about it?" With such directness and such genuine care for the answer that she had to blink. "Very happy," she said. He nodded, satisfied. "Good," he said, and resumed eating with the air of a person who had needed that information. The pregnancy was good, the way some pregnancies are and some are not. The sickness only in the early months and fading by August, and she worked at the mercantile through October, Margaret watching her with the focused attention of a woman who intended to know every development before it happened, and came home each evening to the house that had become entirely home, the sounds of it, the voices of her husband and his sons, the particular quality of the light through the kitchen window in the late afternoon. All of it woven into her sense of where she was in the world now, Clara came every week. They sat in the kitchen and talked about everything, the way sisters talk, with the shorthand of shared history and the ease of people who do not need to explain themselves from the beginning. Clara's own news, delivered in October with an incandescence that Elvira recognized, was that she was also expecting, due in the spring, which meant the cousins would grow up together in this small town that had become, against all initial probability, home. December of 1880, 2 years almost to the day since she had arrived in Redemption Creek with $112 and a borrowed wagon. Elvira Rhodes Trask gave birth to a son in the bedroom of the house on the eastern edge of town, assisted by the doctor and by Clara, who held her hand with the fierce grip of a sister and told her she was doing beautifully. He was born just after midnight on the 17th of December, vigorous and loud and with a head of dark hair, and Micah held him in the lamplight of the bedroom with an expression that Elvira watched and knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He held his son with the hands that had fixed fence posts and mended saddle leather and built a barn addition last autumn and done 10,000 ordinary things, and he looked down at this new person with the expression of a man who is being given back something he had not known was missing. "What do you want to name him?" she asked. He looked up at her. "James," he said. Her throat closed. She had not told him. She had never said the name to him in this context. She looked at him with the full force of what she was feeling. "I thought it was right," he said quietly. "A man who loved you well deserves to be remembered." She could not speak for a moment. When she could, she said, "His middle name can be yours." James Micah Trask weighed 8 pounds and was declared by Eli to be very loud and by Samuel to be a remarkable specimen, and by Daniel, who had ridden the 40 miles from his own land in 2 days to be there, to be the best thing he had seen since the 40 acres. January of 1881 brought a quiet that was the good kind of quiet, the quiet of a household that has found its rhythm. James slept in the cradle Micah had built in October, a sturdy practical thing with the particular care of workmanship that characterized everything Micah made, and Elvira nursed him in the mornings by the kitchen window, while the winter light came through and Eli sat across the table with his drawing paper and his pencils and drew everything. He drew her, sitting there with the baby, and brought her the drawing one morning without comment, setting it on the table beside her coffee cup. She picked it up and looked at it, this rendering of herself in charcoal on good paper, and it was her face and James's face and the window light, and it was extraordinary. "Eli," she said. He looked up. "This is a gift," she said. He looked at it, considering. "It's just drawing." "No," she said. "It is seeing something truly and showing other people what you saw. That is a gift." She set it down carefully. "I am going to frame this." He returned to his drawing, but she watched him absorb what she had said, watched it move through him in the way things moved through Eli, completely and permanently. Micah came in from the morning chores and saw the drawing on the table and picked it up and looked at it for a long time. He looked at Eli. He said, "This is good work, son." Eli said, "She said she's going to frame it." "She's right," Micah said. He set it down. He poured his coffee. He sat at the table with his wife and his youngest son and his new baby in the cradle across the room. He put his hand over hers on the table in the winter morning light. "I love this house," he said, which was not something he had said before, and she understood that he meant more than the house. "I love it too," she said. Spring came, and with it Clara's son, born in April and named William, and the 2 babies occupied the center of both households with the thoroughness that new people occupy the center of things, requiring and receiving attention from every quarter. The town absorbed both births with the warmth of a community that was growing and knew it and was glad. Samuel, 16 now and burning with the ambition that Elvira had been carefully feeding through books and problems and letters to Austin, received word in May that he had been accepted to a preparatory program, affiliated with the engineering college in Austin, a program that the school teacher Mrs. Pratt had helped identify, and the letters Elvira had written had opened the door to. He sat at the kitchen table with the letter in his hands for a long time, and then he looked across at Elvira and said, "You did this. You did this," she said. "I wrote some letters." He shook his head slowly. "You saw it in me before I saw it in myself." She looked at him, this boy who had walked into the mercantile every Saturday morning with his quiet jokes and his easy manner, and who was now the young man who would go to Austin and build something. And she felt the particular satisfaction of having contributed to a person's becoming. "You were easy to see," she said. He left for Austin in August, and the household was different without him, quieter in the specific way that is the shape of a person's absence rather than the absence of sound. And Micah handled it as he had handled Daniel's leaving, with the controlled pride of a man who measures love by what he is willing to release. Eli began talking that same summer about architecture, about buildings, about the way structures related to the landscape around them, the way the limestone bluffs suggested the way walls could be built, the way the creek suggested where foundations should not go. He talked about it in the evenings when the baby was asleep, and the three of them, Elvira and Micah and Eli, sat on the porch with the railing solid under their hands. And Micah listened to his youngest son with the expression of a man who no longer has any anxiety about the directions his children might take, because he has learned to trust the quality of what he helped build. "There's an architectural drafting program," Elvira said one evening, not to Eli directly but into the air between them all, letting the idea breathe. "In San Antonio, through the engineering school there, they take young men who have demonstrated skill." Eli looked at her. "You've been looking into it." "I may have asked some questions," she said. He looked at his father. Micah looked at him. Something moved between them that was the language fathers and sons build over years, and then Micah said, "You should write and ask about the entry requirements." Eli wrote the letter the following morning. He drafted it 4 times. He brought each draft to Elvira and she helped him refine it, not by rewriting it but by asking questions that helped him say more precisely what he meant. The final letter was his entirely, but shaped by the conversation, and it was good. He sent it in September and the response came in October saying yes, they would consider his portfolio, please send drawings. He sent 40 drawings and was accepted in November. He left for San Antonio in January of 1882. The same month that James took his first steps in the kitchen, and fell into the leg of the table, and cried loudly, and then got up and walked again with the determination of a person who has been embarrassed by failing, and has decided that the correct response is to immediately try again. Micah watched James's first steps with his arms folded, and his expression doing the thing it did when he was holding something large. When James fell and cried and got up again, Micah's arms dropped to his sides and he made a sound that was entirely a laugh, a full one, unguarded, and he crossed the kitchen and picked James up and held him up in the air and said, "There he is. There is the boy." James squealed with delight and grabbed his father's nose with both hands. Elvira leaned against the kitchen doorframe and felt the weight of everything it had taken to get here. The $112 and the borrowed wagon and the fence post, and the onions and the notes and the porch railing, all of it. The whole improbable accumulation of small things that had built into this kitchen and this man and this child and this life that was specifically, entirely, irreplaceably hers. She was expecting again. She knew it with the certainty of a woman who had done this before, the particular way the world shifted and slowed and became more interior in those early weeks. She had not told Micah yet. She was waiting for the right moment, which was a habit she had apparently inherited from the man she had married. She told him on the porch that evening in the February cold, both of them wrapped in their coats, the stars doing their enormous work above the Texas plain. He was quiet for a moment after she told him. Then he reached out and pulled her close to him, his arm around her in the winter night, her head against his shoulder, and she felt his breath change the way breath changes when a man is trying to contain something large. "Another one," he said quietly. "Another one," she confirmed. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. His arm tightened. She felt the warmth of him through the coat, the solidity of him, the specific reality of him that was always still something she was grateful for. "What do you hope for?" he asked. "Boy or girl?" She thought about it honestly. "A girl," she said. "I think I would like a girl." A pause. "Then I hope it's a girl," he said. She turned her face up to look at him in the dark. He looked back, and she saw in his face the thing that had been growing there for 3 years now. The love that was not the almost smile anymore, but the full thing, entirely present, entirely his. "I love you," she said. He had been saying it more easily now, with less of the labor of it, though it still carried weight, always carried weight with him. "I love you, Elvira," he said, "more than I know how to say." "You say it fine," she said. "I say it better when I do this," he said, and kissed her in the February cold on the porch above the railing that his sons had built without being asked. And she kissed him back with everything she had. This woman who had arrived with $112 and had found, in this improbable corner of Texas, something worth so much more than she had been looking for. Their daughter was born in October of 1882, small and loud, and possessed from her first hour of a disposition that suggested she was not going to allow the world to proceed without her commentary. They named her Me, and she had Elvira's eyes and Micah's jaw and nobody else's personality whatsoever. Daniel came back for the birth, riding 4 days from his land because Elvira had written that the baby was coming, and he had not needed another reason. He stood in the kitchen holding me with the expression of a young man who has understood something new about what families are, what they can be, how they grow and change and remain. He said, looking at the baby, "I've been thinking about the land. I want to expand, and I think I want to take a wife if I can find the right person." Elvira looked at him over me's head. "There is a school teacher in Millbrook," she said, "who is very intelligent and has a laugh I think you would appreciate." He raised his eyes. "You've been thinking about this." "I have been paying attention," she corrected. "There is a difference." He smiled, the Trask smile that was slow and rare and completely genuine. "Should I go to Millbrook?" "I think you should have a reason to go to Millbrook," she said. "The book-lending library there is very well regarded." He laughed outright at that. He looked at his father, who was standing in the doorway with his coffee, and an expression of complete and satisfied understanding. Micah said, "She's not wrong." Daniel went to Millbrook the following spring. He went back 4 more times. He came home in August with a woman named Frances who had a laugh that filled a room and opinions about everything and hands that were strong from years of teaching children, and a look in her eye when she watched Daniel that told Elvira everything she needed to know. They were married at Daniel's land in October of 1883, 5 years after Elvira had arrived in Redemption Creek with her $112 and her borrowed wagon and her careful, self-protective plan. Redemption Creek had grown by 1883, the rail line having passed through and left in its wake the permanent infrastructure of a functioning town, a proper hotel, an expanded mercantile, a new physician who had come from Kansas City with his wife and their library of medical texts, and a school that now operated in its own dedicated building with 2 teachers and a full curriculum including, on the insistence of the school board, Spanish language and Texas history, taught from the full breadth of its long human story. Samuel had completed his first year of engineering study and written home letters that were increasingly technical and increasingly excited, filled with mathematical problems he was solving and plans he was drawing, and the particular joy of a person who has found the thing they are built to do. Eli had finished his first year in San Antonio and sent home drawings that made Mrs. Pratt weep with something she called the particular satisfaction of a teacher who has seen a student surpass everything she could teach them. The Trask house on the eastern edge of town was a different house from the one it had been in the winter of 1879. Not different in its bones, the same walls and roof and rooms, but different in the way that a house becomes different when it is fully inhabited, when every room carries the evidence of specific lives being lived inside it. The kitchen had her botanical illustrations framed on the wall beside Eli's charcoal drawing of her with James in the morning light. The sitting room had the good lamp she and Micah had chosen together in the spring of 1880, and the reading chair she had brought from Georgia, and the rag rug Clara had made as a wedding gift. The porch had its railing, still solid, the wood weathered now to a silver gray that was beautiful in the afternoon light. And on the porch were two chairs that had become, in the years of their marriage, as much Elvira and Micah's as any piece of furniture could be, worn to the shape of two specific people spending evenings together looking out at the Texas sky. On an evening in the fall of 1883, me 13 months old and already pulling herself upright against every available piece of furniture, James nearly 3, and conducting himself through the world with the bold confidence of a child who has never been given reason to doubt his own welcome, they sat on the porch as the sun went down. Elvira with me on her lap and Micah with James asleep against his side and the air smelling of cedar and dry grass and the particular clean sharpness of Texas fall. "Do you ever think about Georgia?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "Sometimes," she said. "I think about James, about the house, about what it felt like before everything changed." She looked out at the darkening plain. "I don't wish to go back, but I don't want to forget it either." He nodded. That was how he received things that were true and complicated, with a nod that said, "I hear all of it." "Do you ever regret any of it?" she asked. He looked at her. He looked at me in her lap. He looked at James asleep against his side with the boneless ease of a sleeping child. He looked out at the property, the barn and the south fence and the east pasture where his cattle were settling for the night. "Not a day," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder carefully so as not to disturb me. He turned his head and pressed a kiss to her hair. The porch railing stood in the last of the light, solid and straight and built with care by 3 boys who had understood before their father could say it that this was the woman they wanted in their house, in their life, building a future alongside them in the improbable, demanding, deeply generous country of the American West. She had arrived with $112 and borrowed everything else. She had built from those bare materials something that was worth more than she could count. And it had started with a porch railing built without being asked, by 3 boys who were their father's sons in every way that mattered, who had seen a need and met it, and let her understand without words what they were offering. And she had understood completely, and she had said yes to all of it, to the railing and the fence post, and the onions and the dark eyes and the almost smile and the full laugh and the ring with the turquoise stone, and the sons who called her mother now with the ease of long habit. And she had said yes to this evening and this porch and this man and this life, and she would go on saying yes to all of it, every morning of every year that was given to her, for as long as the good land held and the sky kept turning, and the cedar smell came down from the hills, and the man beside her put his hand over hers in the gathering dark, and was, without a single unnecessary word, entirely present.